to those who support the Assad regime. The days are numbered.
I am confident that Assad's days are numbered.
The use of chemical weapons is and would be totally unacceptable. And if you make the tragic mistake of using these weapons, there will be consequences and you will be held accountable.
The Assad regime is allowing, and the Assad regime is aiding and abetting, and the Assad regime is actually carrying out nothing short of a massacre.
The Syrian civil war has been going on for a long time. And today, you hear the Secretary of State, John Kerry, saying it's a massacre that's happening in Aleppo. Before you heard all the days were numbered. Well, we'll just put a number on those. Since the president first mentioned that, it's been 1,749 days since he said the days were numbered for Bashar al-Assad. Now we are seeing a lot of the killing and now the evacuation of people out of Aleppo. Let's bring in our panel. Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Editor-in-chief of LifeZette, Laura Ingraham. Julie Pace, White House correspondent for the Associated Press, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Charles, your thoughts on the latest developments?
Obama imagines that the Obama deal is his legacy. It is not. Aleppo is his legacy. History will remember this as kind of a symbolism of the whole policy of retreat and the inevitable outcome. It's not as if this civil war was going to go one way or the other because of what the United States did. The Civil War was essentially in some kind of equilibrium a year and a half ago when the Russians decided that their side, Assad, was losing. The rebels were actually on the advance in Aleppo and elsewhere. He stepped in to rescue Assad, but then he saw there was no response on the part of the West, no penalties whatsoever, even economic, coming from the United States. And he decided to drive the advantage. And we are reduced now to getting speeches from our UN spokesman pleading, saying to the Iranians and the Russians and to Assad, have you no shame, have you no pity? The answer is obvious. They have none. The only thing that could have stopped this ultimately would have been some kind of deterrent from the United States, warning from the United States to keep the Russians out. We didn't, and now we have what we have.
And Laura, the images out of Syria are painful. Yeah, orphans pleading for their lives.
I mean, as someone who's visited a lot of orphanages and just seeing those children, the eyes of the children, I think Charles is right. It will go down as, without a doubt, I think one of the biggest humanitarian crises, war crimes obviously committed en masse in Syria. The narrative that you can read on Facebook and other videos released of mothers who are asking priests if they can kill their children so they don't have to see them tortured. So we have to also remember years ago when I think the public polling came out on this, remember there was no public support for going into Syria. We also all have to remember that. Obama was seeing those polls. And I think it's also hard because after Iraq, the nation was incredibly war-weary. We'd lost thousands of men, more than $1 trillion, and the public just was like, what are we going to gain here? So that was the sentiment, but this is the outcome of what's happened.
Julie, how much of this and the situation we're in with Syria was about the Obama administration and the president concerned about the Iran deal, concerned that he didn't want to do something that upset Iran, and thereby didn't do anything. And by not doing anything, he was doing something.
I think that now, 5 years later, you can look at some of these pieces and maybe draw those conclusions. But I actually think in real time, if you go back to, I remember this very well, that weekend when he took the walk around the South Lawn with Dennis McDonough and decided to pull back on airstrikes. I really believe that that was more about what Laura was talking about, a country that was war-weary, a president who had won 2 elections at that point on promises of withdrawing the United States from the Middle East. I think this was more about him trying to maintain that piece of his legacy. But Charles is exactly right. This whole dynamic changed when the Russians went into Syria to actively protect Assad. the idea that we are here now trying to negotiate with the Russians is something that didn't have to happen if we had been involved more actively earlier.
Judge, here's the Washington Post, the editorial board. Aleppo represents a meltdown of the West's moral and political will, and in particular a collapse of U.S. leadership. By refusing to intervene against Assad's regime's atrocities or even to enforce the red line, President Obama, declared on the use of chemical weapons. President Obama created a vacuum that was filled by Vladimir Putin and Iran's Revolutionary Guard. As recently as October, Mr. Obama set aside options drawn up by his advisors to save Aleppo. Instead, he supported the delusional diplomacy of Secretary of State John F. Kerry, whose endless appeals to Moscow for ceasefires yielded, as Mr. Putin no doubt intended, nothing more than a humiliating display of American weakness. This is the vacuum in which a President Trump steps into on Syria.
Yes, it may sound funny, but I could not agree more with the editorialists at the Washington Post on this. This is a brilliant and tragic description of President Obama's utter and John Kerry's utter lack of leadership. Leadership so bad that they've made the situation worse. My concern is, and Laura raised this, and it's well known, does the American public have the stomach, have the appetite for the introduction of military force into Syria, which would inevitably lead to ground troops? Do we want to go through all that again? But this is a terrible, terrible tragedy that's going to be put on Donald Trump's desk at noon on January 20th. I don't know which way he's going to go, but the last time he spoke about this, he did not see an appetite amongst the American people for ground troops.
That, I think, is a wrong alternative. People talk about there are only two alternatives: the passivity of Obama, which ended today with Aleppo, or invasion. When the red line was crossed, we were in a position, the French were going to help us, of purely an attack from the air or by cruise missiles to wipe out the Assad Air Force and to disable the airfields. That is not invasion. That would have meant you can't drop the barrel bombs. And secondly, when the Russians started to maneuver, we didn't have to invade. The job of a superpower is to deter the other superpower. There was no penalty the Russians had to pay at any stage in tipping the balance in the war. And that was a role that we could have played short of anything like a ground invasion. And to put it up as the only alternative, I think, is to back up the Obama decision of doing nothing, and we see the result now.
A couple of Fox polls, Laura. President Obama's job performance on the list of items, including the economy, foreign policy, roughly split. ISIS is upside down in this poll. 41% approve, 51% disapprove. And then the question, is the U.S. safer since President Obama took office? Less safe, 43% now. And then you see safer, 20%, same, 35%. I guess the real question about Syria is how much this has spurred on not only ISIS but other terrorist groups, and what that means for us.
Yeah, that are emboldened. I mean, we forget Libya. I mean, the limited intervention policy of the Obama administration with those limited strikes in Syria in 2011 helped, of course, topple Libya, and Libya is now a terrorist haven. I mean, the foreign policy calamities go on and on and on. You know, first the pullout of troops from Iraq, obviously the Iran revolution we didn't support, obviously Benghazi, and this just stuff adds up. And so now the public is, with the benefit of hindsight, saying, gosh, what is our standing in the world? What was our foreign policy, and what is America today? And that is the mood. Andy's right. The mood that the country was in when they elected Trump. Trump is not like rah rah, let's go intervene. He wants a more pragmatic foreign policy that understands the limits of our money, what we have to spend, and the public's will to fight. We still have to have a public who backs up the wars that we're in, and we have to keep the public with the war effort. And I think Bush obviously lost the public in the second Bush term.
We don't really know, though, what the Trump foreign policy will be.
We don't. He has talked at times about putting in troops and taking them out quickly, not having long-term commitments overseas, but he inherits this in, I think, about 5 weeks, and he is going to be inheriting a situation in Syria that is much more complicated than it was when Obama made the decision on the red line.
I just don't see him doing militarily the opposite of what he promised the American public to do, though I sympathize very much emotionally and morally with Charles's argument.
But apart from emotion and the morality of it, We have an entirely new strategic situation now in the Middle East, where Iran and Russia now have total control of Syria and will use it as a base of projecting force, malevolent force, in the region. So Trump's dilemma is not going to be, do I intervene in the Civil War? It's essentially over, and the bad guys have won. Now he's going to have to inherit a really hostile power, an outpost of Iran in a crucial area in the Middle East, and that's the legacy.
Iran was the focus of the Obama administration foreign policy, clearly. The question is whether Russia will be the focus of the Trump foreign policy.